In this, the fifth lesson of the Henry George School of Social Sciences course, Understanding Our Political Economy, we explain how the markets for control of land and natural resources operate to the disadvantage of the markets for labor and capital goods. The result is recurring periods of boom and bust, as well as the constant expansion of income and wealth concentration into a small portion of the population of every modern society. We now come to the insights of Henry George and other political economists ignored by most modern economists. This relates to the power of land monopoly and land speculation as drivers of our cycles of boom and bust. On this subject, Henry George points to land monopoly as the primary destabilizing force, writing, "As population grows and technology advances, land values rise. This steady increase leads to speculation, as future increases are anticipated. Land values are carried beyond the point at which labor and capital would receive their customary returns. Production, therefore, begins to stop." To add credibility to what Henry George wrote, here was the advice from one who knew how market forces worked and how to maximize profits, J. Paul Getty, who said, "If you want to get rich, buy land." But not just any land will make you really rich. Beginning in 1949, Getty paid Ibn Saud $9.5 million in cash and $1 million a year for a 60-year concession to attractive land near the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. From 1953 onward, Getty's gamble produced 16 million barrels of oil a year, which contributed greatly to the fortune which made him one of the richest people in the world. What Getty paid to the Saudis was far below the full annual rental value of the oil-rich lands he controlled. Even more important is the ethical question of to whom the oil beneath the surface belongs: to the Saudi princes, to the Saudi people, to J. Paul Getty and the oil companies who extracted huge quantities of oil for decades, with but minimal payments flowing to the Saudi people. In more recent times, the governments of oil exporting nations realized that their long-term interests rested on raising the price of oil extracted by limiting the supply, that is, by keeping some oil-rich lands idle or reducing production. This practice is not unique. Rather, those who have control over land in all its forms know that holding some land idle will raise the value of other lands with a similar potential use. Henry George thought deeply about this connection. He studied history and observed the contemporary evidence. In the end, he concluded, "The only thing that can explain why people are forced to stand idle when they would willingly work to supply their wants is that labor is denied access to land. It is not that all land is in use. What prevents labor from using this land? Simply that land has been monopolized. It is held at speculative prices, based not on present value, but on value that will come with future population growth. The process by which a relatively small number of individuals came to control vast stretches of land in the Americas required several hundred years. A first step was the removal and near annihilation of the continent's First Nations, and even its great empires, the Aztec, Inca, and Mayan peoples. Once the conquest by European peoples secured the Atlantic coastal regions of North America, frontiersmen were followed by settlers and land speculators into the interior, where many hoped to amass huge landed estates or acquire and hold land in anticipation of population increases and the establishment of towns, roadways, and markets. The Ohio Company, of which George Washington was a principal, is just one example followed by many others as European Americans subdued the continent. A financially weak national government of the new United States of America cheaply disposed of much of the public domain to speculators and later to the railroad companies as part of the bargain for rapid population migration across the continent. Despite the huge land grants and sales, the federal government today still controls 29% of the nation's land area, with most of the lands held concentrated in the western states and Alaska. State and local governments control another 9%. Trust lands for the tribes or First Nations account for roughly 2%. This leaves over 60% of the land, 1.4 billion acres, in private hands. Remember, however, that this is just land area, not land value. Over the last 200 years, much of the land area held by the nation's wealthiest families has, of course, changed hands. Even so, the ownership of land in the United States is highly concentrated and becoming more so every year. Today, just 25 individuals own 19.5 million acres of land scattered across the United States. This is roughly the size of the state of South Carolina. John Malone, who has served in executive positions in the telecommunications industry, now holds over 2.2 million acres of land. In 2011, he purchased 1 million acres of woods in Maine and New Hampshire, acquiring the 290,000-acre Bell Ranch in New Mexico the previous year. Ted Turner, founder of the Turner Broadcasting System, owns around 2 million acres in 12 states and in Argentina. Red Emerson is president of Sierra Pacific Industries, a family-run lumber manufacturing business that ranks as California's largest private landowner. He owns just under 2 million acres of forest land in California and Washington, adding over 100,000 acres in 2011. As impressive as the above land holdings are, think about where the most valuable land is in the United States or any other country. It is in our cities and towns, where land is valued not by the acre, but by the square foot. There's no publicly available data on the ownership of land in the U.S. cities and towns. What we do know is that the ownership of commercial real estate is highly concentrated. The largest 25 real estate companies own a combined total of nearly 4 billion square feet of commercial real estate in the U.S. and overseas, an area considerably greater in size than the city of Boston. Somewhat surprisingly, individuals still own more than 2/3 of all farm acreage. The 32,500 non-family held corporations own just 5% of all farmland in the United States. If we look at just the privately owned agricultural land in the U.S., we find that whites account for 96% of the owners, 97% of the value, and 98% of the acres. Even so, for minority groups, African Americans, First Nations Americans, Asians, and Hispanics own roughly 25 million acres of agricultural land, valued at over $44 billion in 2002. The total value of agricultural land in the U.S. prior to the 2008 economic and financial crisis had reached somewhere around $1.5 trillion. Although this graph includes farm buildings, it is clear that despite the recession, the value of agricultural land quickly regained its upward climb. Agricultural commodity prices are subject to great swings, which makes farming a highly risky endeavor. In the United States and in many other countries, farmers are subsidized in several ways. One is to pay farmers to leave acreage unplanted. Another is to subsidize the insurance premiums to protect farmers against crop failures and natural disasters. Governments also agree to purchase surplus crops or provide a cash payment if the market price for crops falls below a fixed amount. A more recent but significant factor in the attractiveness of owning land is the potential to lease the land for oil and gas exploration or for solar or wind farms. Yet for most of us, the only land we are likely to ever own is the land beneath our primary residence, our home. With so much land seemingly undeveloped all around us, we ought to wonder why land prices are so high. Is it because so much of the vacant land is owned by a small number of individuals and businesses at minimum holding costs? Of the total 2.3 billion acres of land in the United States, some 60 million acres are taken up by the nation's cities and towns. And of this 60 million acres, large sections of almost every town and city remain vacant, underdeveloped, or derelict and abandoned. In city after city, there are hundreds or thousands of vacant lots and boarded up and abandoned buildings. In New York City, there are a reported 30,000 parcels identified by the city as vacant. This totals more than 7,300 acres of land, a valuable but wasted resource for homes, businesses, recreation, and public services. We also have very diverse types of residential development, influenced by multiple factors associated with locational considerations, such as lifestyle choice, willingness or necessity to commute from home to work, the quality of schools for those families with children, the quality of recreational and cultural amenities, and other factors. Newer housing units in the United States have gotten larger and larger, even as the average household size has steadily declined from 3.7 people to 2.6 people. Developers offer more standard features in homes constructed on small parcels of land in closer proximity to urban centers and generally on larger parcels further from the center. Land costs tend to fall as the distance from the center increases. One solution to rising land prices is to gain approval for higher density development. Another response is to build upward. And in many communities where land values have skyrocketed upward, perfectly good residential properties are demolished and replaced with much larger structures designed for a much more affluent buyer. Such replacements are to be expected when rising land values dictate a higher, better use for land than the existing structure provides. For the bottom 90 to 95% of U.S. households, the majority of their net worth is in a residential property, some portion of which is the value of a home and some of which is the value of the land beneath the home. Here is a look at that portion of net worth that is land value. The U.S. population is now around 315 million people. There are 105.5 million households. 65%, or 68.5 million, live in homes they own or will own once they pay off one or more mortgage loans. Foreclosures since 2007 and tightened creditworthiness standards for mortgage financing have pulled the rate of home ownership down from a high of 67%. Statistics compiled by Atom Data Solutions indicated that the median price paid for a single-family property or condominium during the second quarter of 2019 was $266,000. For newly constructed properties, the median price is always higher because new construction only makes financial sense if the potential selling price is at least 4 times the cost of the underlying land. If we use 35% as the land to total value ratio for our median price of $266,000, we get a median land value of $93,100. Multiply this figure by the number of households in the United States, and we get a rough idea of the total residentially developed land value, or $9.8 trillion. What we are experiencing in the United States is the renewed upward climb of property prices long associated with the dynamics of the underlying land markets. Speculation in land is risky, but rather less risky to investors because of the very low interest rates on real estate loans. After 2008, more than one economic market analyst and politician pushed measures to prop up property values in order to save banks and mortgage investors and to allow property owners to refinance out of high-interest mortgage loans and avoid foreclosure. Here is what economics professor Joseph Stiglitz said in an op-ed in the New York Times. The Obama administration's $500 billion or more proposal to deal with America's ailing banks has been described by some in the financial markets as a win-win-win proposal. Actually, it is a win-win-lose proposal. The banks win, investors win, and taxpayers lose. The higher land values become, the higher we build to lessen the cost per square foot of the buildings we need for commerce and residences. In cities such as New York, San Francisco, London, or Tokyo, the world's wealthiest individuals bid up the price for centrally located property, often with no intention of occupying the property for more than a few weeks a year. In every one of these and most other cities, there is a crisis of affordable housing that is worsening with each year. Those of lesser means are forced to the periphery or to leave the region altogether in an effort to lower their cost of living. Business owners make the same decision in an effort to protect profit margins. One result, as described by author Joel Garreau, is the creation of the edge city. Even so, these responses do not work to tame land markets. Prices for land in the edge cities simply climb upward in response to increasing demand. When land prices threaten to absorb too much of the income of business and individuals, an economic crash, recession, or depression is the result. Research by economics professor Fred Foldvari supports the direct correlation between real estate cycles lasting 18 years and the recurring experience of economic booms and busts. Professor Steve Hanke of Johns Hopkins University commented on Fred Foldvari's research as follows. These data talk, and the most interesting thing they say is that every 18 years we can expect the culmination of a credit-fueled real estate and ensuing business cycle. This, of course, doesn't imply that all recessions are preceded by a real estate cycle. It only says that all real estate cycles have spawned economic downturns. This knowledge has allowed for some prescient forecasts. The prize in that department goes to Professor Fred Foldvari, who wrote in 1997, "The next major bust 18 years after the 1990 downturn will be around 2008, if there is no major interruption such as a global war." Such is the power of land markets to drive both investment and speculation. Political economy reveals to us that rising land prices might be welcomed by those who hold land. However, the aggregate effect is to impose great stress on the productive segments of a society. Thus, the rational public policy objective ought to be to do whatever can be done to keep land prices as low as possible. The solution Henry George came to was an old idea, strongly resisted by rentier interests in every society. Eliminate all taxation except for the taxation of the rental value of land. In essence, adopt the single tax. We've reached the end of Lesson 5.